Jude. And so we'll spend some time in the latter parts of these books here, some of the shorter books in the New Testament, and some of the really good books in the New Testament. All of them are good, but as we look at them, there are a lot of things that we need to learn. What I want to do tonight, at the beginning, the outset here, is give just a little bit of an overview of the book of 2 John, and then following that, we'll get into the actual study of the chapter itself. As you look at the book of 2 John, I'm going to just go ahead and ask you this question. Y'all feel free to jump in. Who wrote it? Who wrote the book of 2 John? All right? It is John. Now, if I ask you who wrote the book of Titus, who would you say? You better not say Titus. Titus didn't write it. Titus had it written to him. But in this case, it is John. Almost universally, there's not, I couldn't really find anybody. I studied quite a bit. But almost universally, it is agreed that John, the son of Zebedee, the brother of James, the apostle of our Lord, is the one who wrote this book. Now, if you look in the book, if you go and read the 13 verses, you will not find John's name there. You won't find it identified as being from John. But all pretty well agree that it is from John. And so we may ask the question, why? Why would so many people think that John was the author of this particular book? Let me give you a couple of facts. Number one, Eusebius, you may have heard of his name before. He was a writer, a historian. He was born somewhere around 260 AD, so he's living in the 3rd century. But Eusebius quotes from another guy, a man by the name of Dionysius, who was born sometime in the late 1st century, the early 2nd century, and lived quite a while into the 2nd century. And he quotes from him regarding how John did not name himself in any of his writings. When you go back to the Gospel of John, John doesn't name himself there. The name John, other than John the Baptizer, is not used there. He doesn't name himself as being the one who did it. And when he speaks in the first person, he speaks of himself in the book of John as being the apostle whom Jesus loved. And so he talks about that, but Dionysius goes on and says, concerning the writings, he says he didn't name himself in his writings. He says, not even in the second and third epistles, although they are short epistles, but simply calls himself the presbyter, the elder, as we'll talk about in just a little while. And so we have that writing all the way from the early 4th century, I guess it would be, when he was actually doing his writing. We have that attestation that John is the writer of a man who was born either in the late 1st century or sometime in the early 2nd century. Not only that, but as we think about the character of the book itself, the way that it's written, the language of 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John, they pretty well attest to the fact that they had the same writer. Everyone is pretty well agreed that whoever wrote 1 John wrote 2 John and 3 John because of the similarity of the writing. You know, sometimes when people write, you can pretty well know that who the writer is. I can read some things from some preachers that I know, and I can sometimes tell pretty much who wrote it before I even see the name, just because of the way that they write. And so as you think about that, it's the case here. But 2 men, Polycarp, you may have heard his name before, Polycarp, who was put to death for his Christianity, and a man by the name of Papias. They were both students of John. Both lived in the 1st century and were students of John, and both of them attribute the letter of 1 John to John. And so if we've got them talking about the letter of 1 John being written by the apostle, and then these other two that are so similar in character and in language that it's almost undeniable, then we pretty well have a good attestation that it was written by John. And so as we look at it, we think about it, there's not a whole lot of evidence that's there, not much evidence that comes to us by these ways, but it seems that what we do have is pointing in the direction of John. Within the book itself, there are some clues, and as we look at it and think about the book, let's talk about the date. Talk about the date. If I were to ask you about when was the book of 2 John written, would anybody care to guess tonight? Before y'all go to sleep, I'll let you talk. Okay, sometime in the 90s, all right. There, again, is not a whole lot of evidence, either internally or externally, as to who or as to when it was written. There are no specific events that are mentioned within the book that would help us date it. Nothing of that nature within the book of 2 John in particular that would help us date it. But there are, again, some clues. The writer, the author, who we know, again, pretty well without any shadow of a doubt, was John, appears to have been a very aged man when he wrote this book. As a matter of fact, in verse number 1, he refers to himself as the elder. And again, I'll come back and talk about that more when we get into the chapter itself. It appears that the book of 1 John was written prior to the book of 2 John. There are some things that are mentioned in 2 John that are pretty well direct quotations from 1 John. And so it appears that it came after it. And 1 John, as best we can tell, was written somewhere around 80 AD. So 1 John, written that I could find, is that both 2nd and 3rd John, which were written evidently close to the same time, they appear to have been written close to the same time, were written somewhere around 90 AD. Somewhere around 90 AD, somewhere in that area. And again, we don't have a specific date. Somewhere in the 90s seems to best fit it. And so we'll just leave it with that. We know that it, of course, if it's written by John, it had to be written before his death, and we don't have an exact date on that, but we do know that he was an aged man. Third thing, why? What's the purpose of the book of 2 John? If someone stopped you on the street tonight before you got here and they ask you, well, you know there's a book in the Bible, it's called 2 John, what's it about? Why was it written? Before you came here tonight, what would you have told them? It would be like a lot of folks talking about the sermon. Well, it must have been about sin, and we won't know if the preacher was for it or against it. And you know, sometimes it may be hard to tell in regard to that. But what about the book of 2 John? What is it about? How many times have you ever read the book of 2 John? How many times have you heard someone quote from the book of 2 John? And did we pick up, do we know the purpose of the writing? Now I'm going to backtrack a little bit tonight, and I'm going to ask you about the purpose of the book of 1 John. And we spent a lot of time talking about 1 John, and we went through a lot of things in regard to that purpose in the book of 1 John. All the way through the book, we pointed it out. There wasn't probably a class that went by that we didn't mention something about it. And so what was the purpose of the book of 1 John? What was it that John was writing to refute and warn about in 1 John? That G word that we talked about, Gnosticism, the Gnostic problem. And so he's writing that about that. 2 John is warning again, but it is a varied branch, you might say, of Gnosticism, or at least a camp that camps out in the Gnostic camp, within the same area. In other words, he identifies basically what he's writing against when he talks about those who denied that Jesus had come in the flesh. And remember, the Gnostics that we read about in 1 John, they had a problem with the flesh of, the flesh of Jesus. John writes this one evidently to warn specifically about those who denied, or if you're reading directly from the Scriptures, who did not confess that Jesus had come in the flesh. And so he is warning about that, but he's telling the readers that they are to reject the false teaching and the false teachers who would teach this doctrine as well as others. And he also encourages the readers to maintain their integrity of walking in truth, of walking in the truth. Just stay with the truth and you're going to be all right. If you read through the book of 2 John, you're going to find there are some key words that are found within the 13 verses. 5 times in those 13 verses, mainly in a couple of verses, you're going to read the word truth. He's going to reiterate the word truth. 5 times he'll use the word truth. 4 times he's going to use the word love. And so that's another key word that he keys on in these 13 verses. Truth, love. By the way, what is John known as? The apostle of love. He was the fireball when he was young. We went back and we looked at him and when we were studying 1 John. He was a fireball when he was young. He wanted to call down fire from heaven and, destroy a city. He was a fireball, but he became known as the apostle of love. And so 4 times he mentions that here. 4 times also he uses the word that's translated command, commanded, commandment, or commandments. 4 times he uses that word. And so these are the as he speaks of that, he'll talk about the obedience. That's what he's having reference to of certain ones and what they were to do. And so these are the 4 basic key words of the book of 2 John. Now I want to read you part of a paragraph written by Brother Guyan Woods in his commentary in regard to the purpose of the writing of the book of 2 John. Now listen to what he has to say. He said, "These epistles, though brief, are of much value to us today in that they afford us intimate glimpses into the affairs of the early church in a manner not characteristic of the lengthier and more profound epistles." Now he's talking about both 2 John and 3 John. He says we get an intimate glimpse into the affairs of the church. He goes on and says, they also reveal that all was not always harmonious, even in the apostolic age. And human nature in its darkest forms carried over into the church and influenced the actions of men, even as now. They contain warnings sorely needed in our time and which should not be ignored or disregarded. I think he's pretty well right. And again, he's writing about both 2nd and 3rd John, but both of those books, the warnings against the false teachers and taking them into your house, bidding them Godspeed, if you look at it from the King James Version, and also when you go to 2 John and you see the one guy who pretty much exalted himself above everybody. I would ask you his name, but we'll wait until we get over into 3 John. But as we look at it, we see how people act. And probably, he's right. We get some of these glimpses in how we're to treat one another and things that we may not get out of some of the longer books. They're more personal, I guess you might say, in regard to what is written. Okay? And so we've sort of looked at who the author is, John. We've looked at pretty much when it was written, sometime in the late first century, sometime probably in the 90s. And now we've looked at the purpose. Commentaries, some of them will have several pages in regard to what we just looked at. Some of them will have just a little bit in regard to what we just looked at. But that's all we're going to do with the background and with the overview of the book of 1 John. What I want to do is get into the book itself, because that's what I really like to study and what I'd really like to teach, is getting into the scriptures. And I'll tell you tonight, we're probably not going to get, well, maybe we'll get out of verse 1. But we're going to spend as much time looking at different things as we need to. 2 John, only one chapter, so verse number 1. Let's read the whole verse together. He says, "The elder to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth." Let's break that down into its various parts. We'll take it a word or two at a time, and we'll talk about them. Okay? Let's begin where John begins here. The passage simply begins, the elder. The elder. Let's talk about that for a minute. Sometimes the word that's translated elder here, presbyteros, sometimes that word refers to an office in the church, does it not? Matter of fact, most of us who are members of the Church of Christ, we refer to those men who lead us as what? The elders. Sometimes if you refer to them as shepherds, which is another word that's used for the same group, people will look at you as though you have two heads. What are you talking about? We've used that word elders so much. Is it right to use the word? Sure. That's the word the Bible uses. But there are other words that the Bible uses as well, and they could be equally as effective, and they are equally as effective and equally as important. They refer to different various things in regard to the men who are serving as elders, but sometimes the word refers to an office. Let's look at a couple of passages just to establish that. Somebody read Acts chapter 14, verse 23. Acts chapter 14, verse 23. Whoever gets it first, go ahead and read it out loud for us. Acts 14, verse 23. Okay, Paul had been on his missionary journey, one of his missionary journeys. He had established congregations. He had gone on, established others. They're on their way back. And what did they do as they were on their way back? They appointed what? Elders in every church. Who does that refer to? Well, the same men who are the leaders that we talk about and have just gotten through talking about. Look at another one, Titus chapter 1 at verse number 5. Titus chapter 1, verse number 5.
For this reason I left you in Crete, that you should set in order the things that are lacking, and appoint elders in every city as I commanded you.
Okay, that's pretty well the same thing that we have in Acts chapter 14, isn't it? Paul and his partner on that first missionary journey were helping the churches to establish the eldership. Paul says, I left you, Titus, in Crete in order to do the same thing. Now, let me ask you a question. Is there any doubt as to who these men are or the purpose for setting up these men by when we read these two verses? In other words, what I'm trying to establish is the Bible sometimes refers to the office of the eldership, right? We know that from these two verses. There are others that we could look at, but two should be sufficient. So sometimes the word refers to an office within the church, but sometimes that same word refers simply to one who is older or aged. Turn, if you will, to the book of Luke, chapter 15. Luke 15, and look at verse 25. Luke 15, verse 25. While you're turning there, what story do we find in Luke chapter 15? The prodigal son. Okay? So, when you get down to verse 25, what are you going to read about? Somebody read it out loud if you've got it for us.
Now his elder son was in the field, and he came near to the house, and he heard music and dancing.
Okay? And so, this man, his elder son, that son who's an elder in the Lord's church, right? No. Same word, but it simply refers to someone who is older than the younger son. Did not even necessarily say this man was old. He's just the Okay? Look at another one. Acts chapter 2, verse 17. Acts 2, verse 17. Okay, somebody got it?
In the last days it shall be, God declares, that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams.
Your old men shall dream dreams. Same word. Now, who is he talking about here in Acts chapter 2, verse 17? He sets the old men in, compares them, contrasts them with who? The young men. It's not a trick question or anything. He just compares or writes about the young men, the old men. Is there any way that we could confuse these two verses and think that the people that are being spoken about here are elders in the Lord's church? I mean, if you're reasonable in intelligence and you read, it's pretty obvious he's not talking about elders in the Lord's. In this case, he's simply talking about age, is he not? Now, why did we bring that up? John says, the elder. Which one is he? Is he an elder, as in an elder, an office holder? Or simply an elder, as in an old man? Which one is he? Y'all don't all answer at the same time. I can't hear when y'all all talk like that. Do what? He's the apostle. Well, that's interesting, because Burton Kaufman in his commentary argues because he is an apostle, he refers to himself as an elder, just because he is an apostle. I don't see that. I don't think he could sustain his argument. Even though I like to read from Brother Kaufman, I don't think he can sustain his argument because we're given qualifications of elders, aren't we? What are the qualifications? What are some of them? Be married, have children. How many wives did Paul have? And he was an apostle. None. And so there's problems with that way of thinking. Even though he argues that. Most likely what John is referring to here is that he's referring to himself as the elder because he is an older man. Now there's something that I want you to notice. What's the word that comes before elder? The elder. What is that word? What part of speech is it, I guess, is what I should be asking. Somebody say definite pronoun, right? Definite article, rather. A definite article. And so he is specifying something. But where does anybody else in the New Testament do that when they're talking about an elder in the Lord's church? The elder. Now Peter refers to himself as an elder, doesn't he? In 1 Peter chapter 5 at verse number 1. Somebody turn over there. 1 Peter 5 verse 1. Peter refers to himself as an elder. But how does he refer to himself? Somebody read the passage for us. He says, I exhort the
elders who are among you, I exhort. I who am a fellow elder and a witness of the suffering of Christ, and also a partaker of the glories that will be revealed.
Okay, so he refers to himself as a or an elder. What is a and an? They're both indefinite articles, are they not? They don't specify one. Peter doesn't call himself the elder. You know, if the Catholic Church was correct in saying that Peter was the first pope, should Peter not have referred to himself as the? It's also interesting, and there are several occasions when this happens, but the word the in the original language is not in front of the elders in 1 Peter chapter 5 at verse 1. It's an indefinite. When the definite article is not used in the Greek language, it becomes an indefinite. And so he's just talking about elders that are among you. And he's talking about the elders of the church. We know that from the context. Peter makes that clear. But he doesn't even refer necessarily to the group as the elders. John simply says, the elder, that is, to the elect lady. Now, when you look at that, when you think about it, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful to John, but does it not make sense when John says something like the older guy, the older brother, the old man, to the elect lady? In the book of 1 John, how many times, and I didn't take time to count them, so I'm not asking you for a specific number, how many times, though, did John refer to those to whom he was writing as my little children? Who does that sound like? An older gentleman. I think that's what we have here. John is quite elderly. If this is written in the 90s and Jesus was crucified in the 30s, and John is a man in the 30s, we've got 60 some odd years in between. And so he is getting on up there. And it's no wonder that he refers to himself then as the aged one, to this whoever it is that he's writing to, which brings us to the next section of the verse. To the elect lady. To whom is this epistle addressed?
Church.
Okay, the church. Okay. Is this a figurative representation of the church? Notice the rest of what he says there. To the elect lady and her children. If the lady's the church, who are the children? Okay. To the elect lady and the members. Could somebody please tell me when the church could exist without its members? Is not the church called the called out ones? Is not the church the members? When we speak of the church, we're not talking about some entity and then some group of people. When we speak of the church, we're talking about the people, aren't we? Somebody says, well, it just must be some particular congregation then, right? Well, he says to the elect lady and her children. Is the congregation the elect and then the members not? You see, there's a big distinction here. And if we hold that it's the church, when you get down to verse number 13, the elect lady had a sister. Who was she? So verse 13 says, the children of your elect sister greet you. If the elect lady's the church, who's the sister? Makes you want to scratch your head, doesn't it? Again, quoting from Brother Guyan Woods, out of his commentary, he says, basically when he's commenting on the allegorical use here, as though it's being used in an allegorical sense as a woman, he said to reach this conclusion, one must translate the Greek word kuria as lady, interpret the word lady as a church, and then construe the Greek word tekna, children, as members of the church. Only in the highly figurative portions of the Scriptures is the church ever referred to as a woman, and it seems very unlikely that the apostle in this brief treatise should have used the word thus figuratively. He goes on and says, from all the facts in the case, the preponderance of evidence seems logical to lead to the conclusion that the terms under consideration are literally to be interpreted. That the elect lady was some faithful sister known to John. And I think he's correct. He says, he talks about the preponderance of evidence. What is the evidence? If that clock is right, we don't have time to get into that evidence tonight. And so, you know, television shows, they always give you the teaser. Come back next Wednesday night and we'll try to clear it up as to who the elect lady is. It's very interesting, and if it's some particular sister, how do we come to that conclusion? So you got some homework between now and next Wednesday night to see if you can dig up some information in regard to the elect lady. Okay? All right. We'll have to quit. The bell